Morning, my name is Jeff Sward, and I want to thank Tokinomo for inviting me to participate in their InStore Disrupt event. My current view on in-store disruption is that retailers need to do a much better job of localizing their assortments, considering store size, location, season, and tolerance for risk. And I will note that it's more than a little ironic that the rise of the importance of e-commerce has made in-store execution more important than ever. My consultancy is Merchandising Metrics. Work with brands and retailers on developing content that gives them both great storytelling and profitability. The grounding principle of this development work focuses on 5R content. 5 R's are right product, the right price, the right place, the right time, and the right quantity. A review of the 5 R's shows how difficult it is to be right on all 5 metrics across a broad range of SKUs, locations, and seasonal status. Product and price are both design and data-driven, but the other components are overwhelmingly data-driven. Place and time are driven by risk level, demographics, and seasonality. Quantity is driven by risk level, demographics, and store size. It's complicated. Merchandising is not a post-design process that is a simple editing or curation of designed product. Merchandising starts in concert with the design process in order to give the design process the benefit of past performance where it can inform the development of future product. I call it probability merchandising. It is an informed, creative process that brings as much predictability to the floor as can reasonably be expected. How does a retailer, a wholesaler, or a brand bend the odds in their favor so that both differentiated brand storytelling and the profitability of the business are maximized? Here I'm going to try a little humor because my whole process involves the merging of left brain and right brain thinking, which means the merging of the left brain and right brain people. And they view the world differently. They respond to different inputs. So the dynamic can get a little difficult sometimes, and I thought this cartoon kind of summed it up rather cleverly. I'm the guy at the desk, sitting there trying to make all the trains run on time. Earlier I mentioned tolerance for risk. That's just another way of saying how different locations with different demographics embrace different levels of fashion and novelty. My approach formalizes how the assortment planning process can fine-tune in-store content to recognize all the different variables that need to be recognized. Here's a simple grid that looks at primary and secondary characteristics of all the products. The most basic product graduates to key items with a little fashion twist, and then graduates to fashion product with basic attributes, and finally to the most fashion-forward products. Here's what it looks like on a more simple linear scale. We start with low-risk basics, graduate to key items, and then graduate to trend, and finally end up with the most novelty and high fashion product, which is the highest risk. Note also that this graduation of fashion and product complexity and risk also means a graduating level of manufacturing inefficiency. We can also assign levels of seasonality and shelf life, starting with seasonless basics that have 12 months of shelf life, and then shelf life diminishes from there. Key items with 6 months of life, trend product with 3 to 4 months of life, and the highest fashion and most seasonally sensitive product with 6 to 8 weeks of life. When the two very volatile variables of both fashion and seasonality are combined, it makes it easy to see how difficult it is to plan and execute 5R content for a national change. Even within one overall design, aesthetic, and attitude, There are potentially multiple seasonality requirements at any given time. Boston and Miami have very different needs from September to March. We need to look at risk with a lot of data and a little humor. We need to give risk a seat at the table during development and curation processes. Little Rocket Man here is a humorous way of looking at how a lot of people view risk. He says, I've got my helmet and goggles on. I'm all set. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the risk outweighs the precautions taken. The risk mitigation process needs to be a little bit more robust. Now we need to get very realistic about what we know and what we don't know, where we have data that can reliably predict the future, and where we will be flat out guessing, no matter what kind of data we are currently looking at, because data has a shelf life. This inverted pyramid is a simple graphic way of looking at knowns and unknowns. We graduate from knowns with reliable historic data down to unknowns where we're just going to be guessing. Notice that where we have data, so does everybody else, and that's where the product is going to be least distinctive. It is where the process is not data-driven, but more of a pure creative design process. That's where the product is most distinctive, and that's why risk is a brand's best friend. There is a simplified version of knowns and unknowns based on the 4 levels of risk, which leads to a simplified version of data's role in the process. Here I'm trying to show that data plays a different role in each of the layers of the design and product development process. The key question is there a way to inject more data into the process for the higher risk level of the business? And the answer is yes, but that becomes a whole supply chain conversation. Now that risk has a full seat at the table, the development and curation process can proceed. We need to create a portfolio of products that achieves both great storytelling and profitability. And that's accomplished by managing the level of distinction across the layers of products that the customers ultimately see. Here's what that distinction looks like in a range of Polo Ralph Lauren shirts. Here it's laid out in the simple linear version that I used before. And it's really easy to spot now the graduation in fashion, complexity, and risk. And you also notice in this particular case the graduation in retail prices, although that's not always going to be the case, that the retail prices escalate like that in all of the higher fashion elements. And you can also see that the predictability of the saleability of the bottom 2 layers is certainly going to be higher than the predictability of what's going to happen in the top layers. And here's what that graduation looks like when we're looking at a range of denim from American Eagle Outfitters. Okay, it's time for some left brain numbers. These are actual results from a branded wholesale business I ran back in the USA several years ago. And this is where it gets really interesting. Notice on the most basic product, it was 25% of sales, but 50% of profits. On the most fashion-forward product, 15% of sales, minus 10% of profits. And that's because this was a wholesale business. We had margin deals with retailers, and we had to write them a check when their margins fell below a certain level. Well, overwhelmingly, the checks that we wrote were based on bad sell-throughs on the higher risk levels of product. They didn't take markdowns on basics and key items, or very low markdown rates. So that our profitability as the wholesaler was based on this kind of breakdown, and where we had a lot of exposure in the higher risk products and very little to zero exposure in the lower risk products. That's what makes this process so difficult. You can't just say, well, I'm not going to do the high risk product because I can't make money in it or I might lose money. That's where all the brand distinction is. That's where all the storytelling is. So the whole crux of the matter here is how do I balance these 4 layers of product to have the best possible combination? Here's what it looks like when you put it on a simple graph. And here all I'm trying to say is that if you lose a little bit of money on some of the higher risk product, to me, that's a good investment in brand distinction. But if you over assort in high risk product, it's going to get really, really expensive. And ultimately, it's going to be brand dilutive, not healthy. I've made it a point to walk the same stores in the same mall at the end of January for the past several years in a row. And the assignment I give myself is to look at all the different retailers and to see who's doing what kind of job on seasonal conversion. Who has sold down and out of prior season product, who is up and running on spring, and who has what kind of levels of unsold prior season inventory still on the floor. And sadly, year after year, I'm shocked at the level of unsold inventory that some retailers carry at the end of January. Here's a look at what Talbot's looked like a couple of years ago. And 90% of that product, 1/3 of the store, 90% of it was in the higher risk categories. And here's what Express looked like over the course of 2 consecutive years. They're not quite as heavily leveraged into the higher risk product, but they still had about 1/3 of the store just drowning in prior season inventory. Finally, here's Loft over the course of 2 consecutive years. And I think these pictures demonstrate a really terrific lesson in a retailer that learned a deep lesson. You can see on the left that in 2020, they had to double hang their inventory and they were selling it all at 60% off. The following year, half the inventory, way less leveraged into patterns and high risk, and that markdown sign reads 50 off. To me, that demonstrates a really solid contribution to profitability. They learned a lesson. I know I've covered a lot of ground here, but with all the conversation about data these days, I wanted to make the point that, to me, in my opinion, it's about how data and design are merged and managed together. I think that's how great brands and retailers are going to distinguish themselves in the eyes of the customer. And finally, I want to leave you with this equation, which, because it's alliterative, I just think it's very easy to remember. Explore plus experiment plus execute equals experience. Customers want to explore and experiment. Retailers need to execute with that in mind. And if they do that, they're going to deliver a great experience. Remember, it's not a simple sum of the parts. It's exponential. And with that, thank you, Tokinomo.